What if the most dangerous stretch of ocean on Earth, just 33 miles wide, triggered a war that shook the entire global economy? That is not a hypothetical. That is happening right now. The United States and Iran are 39 days into an active military conflict. A 12-week ceasefire was just announced, hours before American bombs were set to fall in peace. Talks are scheduled to begin in just days. But here's the question nobody is fully answering yet. What is America's next move if those talks fail? Stay with me, because in the next 10 minutes I am going to break down exactly what has happened, what the ceasefire really means, and most importantly, the concrete steps the U.S. is already preparing to take against Iran. To understand where this is going, you need to understand where it started. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, carries roughly 20% of the world's oil supply every single day. Iran's control of that strait has always been leverage. And when tensions escalated 39 days ago, Iran used it. The closure of Hormuz sent global gas prices spiking overnight. Within days, American consumers felt it at the pump. Political pressure on President Trump mounted fast, and so did the military response. His forces launched what can only be described as a systematic destruction campaign against Iranian military infrastructure. Over 10,000 Iranian military sites have now been struck. 92% of Iran's large naval ships gone. 2/3 of its missile and drone production facilities destroyed. The United States achieved air dominance early and has maintained it ever since. But wars do not run on military wins alone. Politically, this conflict has been complicated from day one.
Satellite data confirms over 10,000 sites struck in Iran. In response, the U.S. Navy deploys a carrier group to the region. Domestically, gas prices have spiked to address the nation.
Now let us talk about casualties, because behind every geopolitical headline are human lives. Iran has reported approximately 2,076 deaths since the conflict began. On the U.S. side, 13 military personnel have been lost. In Gulf states, 28 lives. In Israel, 26. These numbers are not just statistics. Every single one represents families, communities, and a cost that no ceasefire agreement can undo. It is worth holding that reality for a moment before we move into strategy and politics. Iran's IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has not been sitting still either. While the U.S. has dominated in the air and at sea, Iranian cyber units have been active targeting American infrastructure systems. Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export hub, was struck in recent days. The U.S. forces deliberately avoided destroying the core infrastructure, a calculated signal that the escalation dial can go much, much higher. So how did we get from full-scale military strikes to a ceasefire, and what does the ceasefire actually mean? President Trump had issued a hard ultimatum: reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face strikes on Iranian infrastructure. The clock was ticking. And then, just hours before that deadline expired, both sides blinked together. A 2-week suspension of airstrikes was announced, mediated by Pakistan. Not a peace deal. Not a withdrawal. A pause. Pakistan's role here is significant. Islamabad has maintained diplomatic relationships with both Washington and Tehran, making it one of the few countries capable of sitting at the table with both parties. Peace talks are now scheduled to begin this Friday, April 10th in Islamabad. The basis for those talks is a 10-point peace plan that Iran has put forward. The key elements include full U.S. troop withdrawals from the region, the lifting of American sanctions on Iran, and a framework for coordinated transit through the Strait of Hormuz, meaning ships from all nations could pass safely under an agreed international protocol. Now the U.S. has not accepted this plan. What they have agreed to is to sit down and talk about it. That is a meaningful difference. This is the part of the video you came for. What is the United States actually going to do next? Let me walk you through the 3 most likely scenarios, and which one I think is talk succeed partial deal. If the Islamabad negotiations produce even a partial agreement, perhaps a temporary Hormuz transit arrangement and a freeze on nuclear program expansion, the U.S. would likely agree to phase sanctions. Relief American troops would not leave the region. But a drawdown of forward deployed forces is possible. Gas prices stabilize. Both governments claim a win. This is the best-case scenario, but it requires Iran to accept significantly less than its 10-point plan demands, and the U.S. to accept more political exposure than it currently wants. Talks collapse, escalation resumes. If negotiations break down after the 2-week window, the U.S. military posture is already set for a rapid return to strikes. The deliberate restraint shown at Karg Island, hitting nearby targets, but sparing the oil terminal itself, is a clear signal. The next phase of strikes would almost certainly target Iranian energy infrastructure directly, aiming to economically cripple Tehran's ability to fund the conflict. Expect strikes on refineries, additional port facilities, and potentially power grid infrastructure in military zones. This would accelerate Iran's economic collapse, but also spike oil prices globally, a major domestic political risk for the White House. Scenario 3. Limited deal. Prolonged low-level conflict. The most likely outcome, based on how these negotiations typically work, is a messy middle ground. A partial agreement gets the strait nominally reopened under some form of monitored protocol. U.S. and Iranian forces remain at elevated readiness. Sanctions are partially eased but not lifted. The IRGC continues cyber operations. This conflict does not end. It transforms into a slow-burn standoff with occasional flare-ups. Think of it like a managed hostility rather than a resolved conflict. What makes this moment genuinely unpredictable is that both sides have clear domestic political pressures forcing them toward hardline positions while simultaneously having strong economic reasons to de-escalate. That tension is exactly why a 12-week ceasefire was possible, and also why a final peace deal remains extremely difficult.
Iran's actions on Karg Island are a serious escalation.
We are responding to foreign provocations. Our actions are defensive. This will impact global oil markets and trigger a response.
Here is what I want you to take away from all of this. The U.S.-Iran conflict is not just a Middle East story. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the intersection of global energy, international shipping, and great power competition. Every day it stays closed or unstable. Economies around the world absorb the shock. The 12-week ceasefire is a window, not a solution. What happens in Islamabad on April 10th will shape the next chapter. Watch for 3 things: whether Iran softens its demand for full U.S. troop withdrawals, whether the U.S. offers any concrete sanctions relief as a goodwill gesture, and whether Pakistan can hold the table together long enough for a framework to emerge. If those 3 things happen, we might see a path out of this. If they do not, the military option is still very much on the table, and the U.S. has already demonstrated it is prepared to use it at a scale Iran clearly did not anticipate.
Global shipping routes are the arteries of world trade. Oil tankers navigate vital sea lanes, transporting essential cargo. Tensions rise in Islamabad. The world informed. Subscribe now.
If you found this breakdown useful, hit subscribe, because this story is not over, and I will be covering every major development as it happens. Drop a comment below. Do you think the Islamabad talks will succeed? Or is this ceasefire just delaying the inevitable? I read every comment. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is actually going on. Most people are getting a fraction of this story. See you in the next one.